Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Welcome to the Blue Economy session. If that's what you're meant to be, then you're in the right place. My name is Grant Stentiford. I'm paying a short visit to South Africa for something else, and I've been drafted in to help with this session today. I work for the UK government, and my sort of specialism is I'm a pathologist that works on aquatic animal health. But most of that in my world is applied to aquaculture and trying to keep animals alive in farm production systems around the world. So I'm going to quickly introduce this session before I hand over to colleagues who are going to go through specific aspects of aquaculture. I'm going to place aquaculture into the realm of One Health, which might be an interesting sort of new way of thinking about how our food systems fit into One Health. So just please bear with me, and it'll make some sense as we go through. You may be aware that aquaculture is one of the fastest growing food sectors on Earth. When I was born in 1975, only about 1 in 10 portions of fish, and by fish I mean shellfish, seaweeds, mollusks, crustaceans, and fish themselves from rivers, lakes, seas, and oceans, only 1 in 10 portions was coming from aquaculture. So we've all grown up in a world where most of the fish we eat is captured from the wild. We're now at a place where about 50% of the fish we consume globally is coming from aquaculture, so grown rather than captured sources. And by the time my kids get to my age in about 2050, the majority of the fish we eat will be coming from aquaculture. So we're at an inflection point here about where our aquatic food is coming from. And we're really interested in this kind of doubling of growth that needs to occur in aquaculture as fisheries globally as flatlines and even potentially declines over the next 30 years. So we need to be growing more fish and fish-like products in water to make up that gap. We've been doing some work on what we call the Aquaculture Adoption Index, which asks the question, how much fish, and that's the broad context of fish, is eaten in your country, and how much of that fish potentially comes from grown rather than captured sources. And you get this sort of matrix of nations here, which along the top, it doesn't matter the details, along the top is how much fish you eat from over the average to much less than the average. And down the left-hand side, we've asked the question, how much aquaculture per capita is going on in your nation? And every nation exists on that spectrum somewhere. Just for interest, if you're from South Africa, so you may be interested in this, sorry, I've gone on too far. You exist in this space at the bottom here, which means on average, you eat less than the average global consumer in terms of fish. It's about 20 kilos per annum is the average. You're eating less than that per capita as a nation. There's variation within that, of course. And if you ask how much of that fish that you consume comes from aquaculture, it's less than 5%. So if you wanted to think about an industry to grow in the future, to grow protein, then you've got a very good example right there of where that could occur. That's mapped out on the map here. The red countries are those which are at the lowest end of this table, which have yet to develop an industry to service their requirements for seafood or for fish over the future. Just some context. I can send you these papers if you're interested in more analysis, but every nation exists on there somewhere. We've been leading up a thing over the last couple of years in the UK that we call One Health Aquaculture. If we think that aquaculture is going to expand greatly in the next number of years, which we think it probably will be, then it's really important that we do that right. We don't want to be expanding a sector that disproportionately uses the environment in a bad way, displaces people, doesn't bring people into that equation. Traditionally, aquaculture has been seen as a sort of a subject matter that people like myself talk about at conferences to each other, who we already know about this stuff. But actually, aquaculture is a food sector that fits into the food system, and it's of interest to all of us if we eat that food. So we asked the question, well, what sort of metrics would we want to see built into that system over the next, say, 20 or 30 years if we are to be doing this in a way that is sustainable and using One Health principles? And when you ask that question, you get something like this wheel, which is a set of metrics around the outside, which are not only aquaculture metrics. They're protection of biodiversity, their gender equality, their creation of good jobs, their creation of wealth, their protection of the environment, their optimal water usage, their animal health, my area. but only one bit of that wheel is my area. So it sort of brings a wider group of people into that conversation who need to be involved in making this sector work into the future. You can read more about that. There's a collection of papers in Nature Food around something called One Health Aquaculture that's growing. Really importantly in that, and some people here are going to cover some of these aspects within this session, you need to think about the scenarios that you want to create. And what we've said really importantly around that wheel, some of the first things you need to do in aquaculture is keep organisms alive and healthy in the production system. If you can't do that, you're not going to get any food at the end of it. And really importantly, the organisms that you're producing in that production system need to be able to be consumed. If you can't eat them, they're not food. It's only seafood if you can eat it, right? So you must control the hazards that are in the water system of the environment that you're growing them in. And this is, again, a follow-up paper to the One Health paper, which really talks about that. You define the scenario at the top. I hear a lot about in South Africa, Sandana Bay being a potential place for mollusk farming. So think about that bay, think about what you want to do with the food. If you say, well, actually, we want to farm in the bay, we want to create oysters that we want to export to the European Union for consumption raw. That's a scenario, right? It's not the only scenario, there are lots of other ones, but that's one scenario. If you go through this sort of risk process and you ask what hazards may interact with the supply chain of that organism you're looking to produce in that location, you may well come to a point where you say, well, we can't do that because we're going to breach limits for X, Y, and Z for that export trade. So going round the loop here, you can either mitigate and manage those hazards to allow that to occur, or change the scenario, the way you use that food, the way you produce that food, or whatever. But it's really important to remember that aquaculture potential is linked to the environmental quality in which you're trying to do it. So environment policy and food policy is often a separated process in many nations. And our proposal is that that has to come very much closer together to make some of this work. And finally, what we're looking to do, or what I'm doing in South Africa this week, is if you can do that for aquaculture and you can think about the hazards that interact with the supply chain, that aquaculture sector sits within a system of other food production. So that could be seaweeds, it could be cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, whatever. And they've all got a hazard profile. They all interact and sit in the environment. So one thing we're trying to propose here is if you can do it for aquaculture, let's link the food sectors together and understand how hazards interact with the whole system, control them at source, and hopefully have big ripple effects through the food sector and food systems that could be measured in terms of economics, more food and safer food for people to eat and more trade. But if you go out along that line, if you reduce the amount of space you need for that production because you're controlling hazards, you can protect biodiversity, which is in the space where you're farming, less space used, more species saved. And by its nature, if animals are not dying in the production system, you are then creating a more efficient food system that doesn't use as much greenhouse gases, water, nitrogen, phosphorus, fertilizers, and so on. So you're creating climate efficiency along the axis at the top. And what we're trying to do with South Africa right now is build this so-called one food model where we think about these sectors and the environment they sit in. We don't separate them out along aquatic versus terrestrial systems. And we look at the wider benefits of doing that beyond just food and money and trade into protection of biodiversity and protection of the climate. And the food system is therefore a pivot around which One Health policies can be applied. And it makes some sense that that's a common sense approach to how food systems should sit within our environment. And this was the first workshop. If you're interested in this area, we're looking to create much more interest in this area because it makes a lot of sense. It's the right thing to do. And I think this could be the start of a new movement where aquaculture and other sectors fit together to create better food for people in a better environment.